Hello, and thank you for attending 2021 Sunstone Symposium session titled 112, Oh Juanita, 10 Things I Learned Researching the Life of Juanita Brooks. The audio from this session will be available for purchase at sunstone.org after the symposium. If you're attending in person, remember to shop at our Handcrafters Row, support our vendors, hit up the Benchmark bookstore, and grab your ticket at the registration for the closing picnic. At Sunstone, we make it a goal to build community and allow for people to express their faith. Our tagline is, "There's more than one way to Mormon," and we invite you to help build a community where all paths are given a space to be better understood. Please support us in this mission by making a donation or subscribing at sunstone.org. A little bit about this presentation. After years of researching the life of Mormon historian Juanita Brooks, I will share 10 short stories that give fascinating glimpses into the American West, Mormon history, and the character of Juanita Brooks. Why did Brooks have such an affinity for John D. Lee? What were her blind spots as a historian? What do her papers say about the larger story of Mormonism? Because the session is being pre-recorded by me, there will be no in-person Q&A. So please type your questions into the Whova app and I will try to address them, all conference long. I'm pre-recording this session because I'm going to be busy doing a lot of other sessions and helping run the symposium. And as always, special thanks to our events manager, Grace Poole, for all that she does behind the scenes. Okay, now for the main event, the Juanita Brooks session. So for the last 2 years, I've had the wonderful opportunity of researching the life and the works of Juanita Brooks for a forthcoming biography, which I'm working on, which is currently over 400 pages long. And as part of the research, I've dedicated really every night of every single week combing through her papers. My research has led me to the archives of several institutions, her papers being hosted at the college, the institution formerly known as Dixie State University, which contained correspondence, manuscripts, planners, notes, personal papers, things like that. Weber State, which hosts the Levi Peterson papers, and Levi Peterson so brilliantly did a biography of Juanita Brooks, which I definitely recommend if you want to know more about her. Columbia University Archives, which admittedly contain very few records of Brooks, but plenty on her program and the school at the time of her attendance, and so many other places. But for this presentation, I'm going to focus on the vast collection hosted at the J. Willard Marriott Library at the University of Utah, which houses hundreds of her letters, other correspondence, manuscripts, notes, and diary transcriptions. It's really an incredible, rich resource that was recently digitized in 2019. I can't tell you how remarkable this collection is and how grateful I am to the library and archivists who made this possible. Where Juanita had to take the night bus back and forth from St. George to Salt Lake, I get to hop on the internet. It's pretty easy. I honestly don't know how they did it back in the day. Before I start, I begin a little sheepishly. Students of Utah history will likely already be familiar with many of the papers in her archive, including really foundational Utah history texts like the John Gwynn memoir, Isaac Haight diaries, autobiography and correspondence, John D. Lee's diaries and notes, and so much more. There's a lot of good stuff in there. So I hope those who are already familiar with this history will forgive me for the repetition and feel free to correct me should they feel my interpretations are outdated, immature, or just plain incorrect. Truthfully, my OCD combined with a really hard year of COVID isolation has given me a really unique opportunity to read thousands of pages in her collection, and I'm not exaggerating. In the last month alone, just this last month preparing for this, I've read and indexed about 150 manuscripts, transcriptions, letters, and notes. Like Juanita, I do not sleep very much. And like Juanita, I read until my eyes are so tired that they hurt. I have devoured these papers with a hunger that I'm still trying to understand. The only thing I can say is that once you dive into these collections, you soon become amazed at the vastness of it. And my mind won't let me rest in the research. I also think that this has been a coping mechanism for an otherwise difficult year. Diving into her archives is always rewarding. In every file or diary of some pioneer colonizer, she'll usually have notes, or there will be a hidden letter of some sort tucked away and waiting to be discovered. As I finish my first draft of my manuscript, I've become bedeviled with this idea that I want to see and read every scrap of history she left behind, which of course is a fool's errand, since her impact is broad and continuous, as is her legacy. Plus, she typed way more than I will ever be able to read. But we're going to try. So I'm going to start this slideshow right here. And hopefully I can do this. And we'll get going. All right. Like I said, I've escaped a very stressful year that was 2020 and 2021 by transporting myself back into the past. Most often I spend time in the first half of the 20th century, but often I find myself in 1850s Utah, becoming better acquainted with folks like Martha Cox, Emma Batchelor, Anne Gorge, my own great-great-grandmother Priscilla Levitt, Jacob Hamlin, Mary Hafen, Dudley Levitt, Nephi Johnson, Chief Toab, Sylvester Mowry, the Lee family, Solomon Chamberlain. And then I come back into the 20th century to Jack Weston, Mabel Jarvis, Dale Morgan, Fawn Brodie, Maureen Whipple, and so many others. My hope with this presentation is that more historians will utilize her collection, which is truly a great treasure and contains innumerable gems for historians. If my brain ever lets me rest and this book finally gets done, and if Craig Smith isn't already on top of this, I'm hoping to gather and edit some of her unpublished manuscripts like Craig did with her incredible letters, and I would definitely recommend to check his book out as well. I hope to tell you soon, in much less than 400 pages, got to edit it way down, about the life and importance of this woman, Juanita Brooks. But today, in this short hour, I hope to share with you a list of some of the fun finds in her papers and hopefully point interested scholars in new directions. I recognize much of her research has been added upon and new scholarship has emerged since some of her discoveries, shedding light on updated conclusions and stories. Still, there is so much undiscovered information in this collection that needs to be rediscovered by modern historians. I could tell you hundreds of stories that shocked, surprised, and confounded me while I was reading through these papers. Instead, I chose 10 very random, very discursive topics that I find interesting and noteworthy, and I hope to present them here. For this presentation alone, I'm pulling from about 50 different documents, and I'm going to present a short bibliography to get you started after the presentation. Like I said, each story is standalone, and my selections don't really have a theme outside of my interest in them. Hopefully each of you will find something in them that grasps your attention. So let's start with the first one. The Indian slave trade was complicated. So first, as a white descendant of Mormon colonizers, I want to be careful to not overstep on my conclusions. I represent a largely white perspective and have been immersed my entire life in the theology of Lamanite inferiority and manifest destiny. While I try to responsibly unpack harmful and racist ideas, it's impossible for me to see all of my blind spots. I submit these opinions with the humility that my upbringing and position in society might warp my perspective, or at the very least, limit it to sympathize to the sympathies of the colonizer and not the colonized. My entire growing up presented me with one perspective of Native American culture and lore. I didn't see the term Indian as an offensive erasure of individual tribal identity imposed by a government interested in discounting the humanity of hundreds of thousands of people. I instead saw it as a folksy character that would show up in the story of my great-grandparents. As a descendant of the Levitt family myself, I was raised on the same stories Juanita Brooks was about how our ancestors were always generous and kind with the Indians. We helped them, we fed them, we saved them from an otherwise degrading existence. But as I got older and I had the opportunity to interact with both interact and receive criticism from more seasoned Western scholars, specifically Indigenous ones, I realized how ridiculously callow my perspective was. Amanda Hendricks Komodo, a wonderful mentor and friend, pointed me to the book Violence Over the Land, which was my first introduction to disrupting the narrative of how I understood Indigenous American history. This book, along with Blackhawk's incredible scholarship, helped acquaint me with the generational trauma narratives that shape tribes like the Southern Paiute, which show up in Juanita Brooks' papers all the time. I learned about the slave trade for the first time there, the complexity of the Mexican Ute slave trade, the idea that the Utes were both generational victims and eventual perpetrators. And after that, I dove completely into Indigenous history from the perspective of tribal scholars whose ancestors were impacted by the actions of my ancestors. Works of Elise Boxer, Angela Baca, Thomas Murphy, Farina King, Moroni Benali, and so many others. Over time, and perhaps as an effect of my own white guilt, I developed a thesis that my ancestors were simply greedy and selfish, ruthless colonizers that took and destroyed under the guise of saving the Indians. But history isn't so easy. The sins of colonizing started before my Levitt family settled the Uinta Basin. These generations of Mormons were a symptom of the United States' view of manifest destiny, European imperialism, and white supremacy. This brings me to the papers of Juanita Brooks. Her archives are a treasure trove for anyone interested in understanding the slave trade in the territory, mostly from the colonizer's perspective. But not just that. As I will talk about later in the presentation, there were documents from the Native perspective that I hadn't ever heard of or seen before. Their voices aren't always as invisible as we think. Without theorizing more, I will say the Indian slave trade was tremendously complicated. There are few white hats and plenty of black hats in the story. While Juanita Brooks and others have theorized that Mormons decimated Native tribes to near extinction, the story of how that happened isn't as straightforward as massacres and disease. Mormons traded, bargained, bought, and swindled tribes out of their land, and there is no question that their actions devastated the future autonomy of Native tribes. But the details and the subtlety, the niceness of how it was accomplished is worth investigating because it echoes similar ideas today. I think any good historian or researcher, storyteller, or descendant of Mormon colonizers should spend more time exploring these stories with a more critical lens and one rooted in theories given to us by Indigenous scholars. Juanita Brooks's papers contain hundreds of pages on Shoshone, Ute, Paiute, and Navajo stories and interactions. The narrative that Mormons were somehow black-hatted villains might not be so simple, but neither is the idea that they were more charitable and kind than others, unless kindness is only looked at through a lens of strategy and domination. So yes, that's my thesis on this first one. Probably a dumb one, but the Indian slave was very complicated. It was a huge economy and included Mormons in a variety of ways that we should be incorporating, because that economy is a huge part of what shaped our history, and it continues to shape it to this day. So I hope that people will look up on that more. To number 2, damn it, Danites. Here's the second idea. Danites were more common than we like to talk about. I realize this is a subject of study that has long fascinated scholars and critics and is a bit polemic, and in the sense of the apologetics vastly downplays the occurrence of Danite violence, and the critics of the church sometimes exaggerate their prominence. The body count of Danite activities is as shadowy as the organization, and we never truly will know just how prevalent the secret police were in the church. What I will say is that their reputation amongst Latter-day Saints throughout the territory and beyond was likely more powerful than the organization itself. I have encountered mentions of their activities in several dozen accounts in her papers, from Gentile to Mormon. Their presence was felt, understood, and the looming threat of their violence was fairly tangible during at least 2 decades of the Utah period, ranging from 1850s and the 1860s. How much their mythology lines up with fact isn't as interesting to me as the power of their notoriety. What I mean is, it didn't really matter to Mormons and the Gentiles on the frontier how accurate the legends were. The fear and threat of the Danites was powerful and real enough. To deny the culture of violence that surrounded them and their palpable presence in the lives of Utahns, especially Southern Utahns, is hard to deny. Their fame pervaded songs, ballads, campfire stories, newspapers, diaries, and exposés. So I hope scholars won't shy away from talking about the role that militias, secret police, the Nauvoo Legion, and Danite remnants had in this history, because it was there, and at the very least was a very real part of pioneers' imagination and identity. Okay, on to my third point, Dale Morgan. If you don't know who he was an early scholar and contemporary of Juanita Brooks. She called him her intellectual companion, and they have this beautiful archive of their scholarly letters back and forth. So here's my third point. I'm in love with Dale Morgan. That's it. That's my third slide. I know for a fact he isn't sealed to anyone in the celestial kingdom, so I'm gunning for him. So you've all been warned. I mean, look at him. Look at that handsome, brilliant man. He was quirky, weird, deaf as an adder, which probably means we would get along great. I've really come to respect him and his work through her papers. On to my fourth point. Paiutes are an underrepresented group in Mormon history. So first, some background. In 1934, and largely as a response to the Great Depression, the government instituted several programs under the Federal Relief Act to help Americans stay employed. The Public Works Project was instituted to help rural areas. And this led to Juanita Brooks overseeing what would be a critical collection of pioneer diaries. She employed people in her community to gather old journals, photographs, and diaries of Utah pioneers and early residents of the territory. What is known in her collection of really important diaries like John Gwynn, Isaac Haight, Lee, and many others, but what is lesser known is the value and importance of chronicling and gathering the stories of local bands of tribes in the area. Which sort of leads me to this fourth point. The Paiute and Navajo narrative is severely underrepresented in Mormon studies. I realize this is like saying John Taylor was a handsome man. Duh, we all know this. It's obvious, very true. But I was under the impression that due to a lot of cultural, political, and religious circumstances, we didn't have a lot of information on tribal experiences among the Mormons. I really appreciate the work of Paul Reeve, Elise Boxer, Darren Perry, Todd Compton, and many others who go to great pains to incorporate, center, and highlight the experience of Native Americans. But I was also astounded at the rich resources that we do have. Part of the problem is much of our documentation is written from the perspective of the colonizers, the Mormons, but I was surprised to find some first-person accounts of Paiute, Southern Paiute, Ute, and Navajo experiences. For example, Mabel Jarvis, under the direction of Juanita Brooks and the WPA project, this Public Works project, transcribed several pages of Tony Tilohash. Tilohash was a Southern Paiute man born in Kaibab, whose remarkable memory led to the recording of at least 200 Southern Paiute legends, songs, and dances. And so to find this transcription was a real gift. And you can see this is one of the ones that Mabel Jarvis, one of Juanita Brooks's friends and a great scholar in her own right, typed up the Tillahash stories. This is the story about the coyote. There was a lot of legends in the Paiute about local animals, and coyotes were part of that. Foster Charles, son of Southern Paiute leader known as Old Toab, also has a rich recorded history. He helped participate in the WPA project as a translator, editor, and collector. He also recorded his own story, and much of what we know about Toab's life comes from him. For reference, Toab is an important character in the story of John Wesley Powell's 3 murdered men in 1869. And while their stories are severely underrepresented in our archives for a number of valid reasons as the result of colonization, the lives of Indigenous people that Mormons walked around were an almost constant presence in much of Utah and Mormon history. But we rarely, if ever, see them appear as characters in the story. The diaries and records of the very least offer no excuse. The diaries and records in her papers offer, at the very least, no excuse for this, for they appear in for Paiutes and Indigenous people appear in nearly every diary and many, many letters of early Mormons for at least a century, 1850 and beyond. When scholars are telling the stories of Mormons during this time period, we should have a consideration for their representation. I think the mechanism of the violence of Mormon colonization is continued when we don't include more Indigenous stories, characters, and perspectives into our stories. All right, on to my next one. So this next one is very difficult for me to admit for several reasons. First, growing up in an extremely saturated Mormon neighborhood and experience, I still hold on to old biases in how I see Mormon history. One of those is the dominance of the LDS narrative, of this linear line from Joseph Smith to Brigham Young. Seamless, logical, and nearly smooth. Joseph and Brigham are linked in a chain of prophetic leadership that seems inextricable in Mormon history. The second reason what I'm about to talk about is so difficult is because if anyone has been following my podcasting adventures, especially my latest role in the Hay with Joseph Smith polygamy deniers on the Sunstone Mormon History podcast with Brian Buchanan, I really don't want to give the wrong impression or say something that will seemingly strengthen the view of my enemies. I'm just kidding. Joseph Smith deniers, we're not enemies, but friends trying to untangle a very messy history. And I hope you'll take my podcast jabs as good-natured fun. But here's my shocking thesis. Brigham Young really did start his own church. What I mean to say is the Mormonism that I'm familiar with, lived, loved, laughed, and loathed, is often traceable to Brigham Young's doctrines, insecurities, policies, and pride. Admitting this is really hard for me, especially among Joseph Smith polygamy deniers, because there's this idea that Joseph Smith had really good stuff and Brigham corrupted it. That's sort of the thesis of the polygamy deniers. Joseph Smith had it right, Brigham ruined everything. In this, I kind of agree, mostly. I'd rather not weigh in on the morality of Joseph Smith's theology in this presentation. Saying this doesn't exonerate Joseph Smith from polygamy. The evidence is overwhelming that he practiced it. I stand by that. If you want to see my opinions on that, I've recorded at least 3 podcasts on the subject, including the latest at the Sunstone Mormon History podcast, where we go through the literature of polygamy denials and hit it line by line. I stand by this. But even I can admit that Brigham Young changed, updated, and transformed many things, often reappropriating memories and theologies of Joseph Smith to serve what I believe to be mostly Brigham Young's own interests and viewpoints. Going through these papers has only amplified the magnitude of what Brigham Young accomplished, for better or for worse, in the history of America. It's really hard for me to admit. Brigham Young's pride, his racism, his misogyny offends me. Reading how he crumpled the souls of many doubters, Mormons with no property or prospects, and women, and particularly Black people, has burrowed in my heart a deep resentment towards Brigham Young. Joseph might have captured the hearts of the followers, but Brigham took over their autonomy, their property, their loyalty in ways that Joseph Smith would have never been able to accomplish. I don't want to give him credit, and yet as a strategic colonizer, Brigham Young is unmatched. I'm sure I'll talk about this in much greater detail when we get into the Utah period on the podcast. But the papers show just how prominent Brigham Young was, how present he was in the lives of every Mormon, even if he didn't interact with them. For now, I'm just going to show you a really, really fun tangential letter that really doesn't have anything to do with the thesis, but it's just an example of kind of the fun stuff that you can find in her papers. This note is a bit off topic for the subject, but it does show how Mormon reformers like Joseph Smith III and Brigham Young shape things and how divergent they come. A. Milton Musser going after Joseph Smith III is amusing and sad. You can see this here. Francis Lyman is telling Musser not to go too hard and not to roast Joseph Smith III too much. Where once these men would have been united in Nauvoo under a prophet, things really, really changed and continue to do so. And I just think it's interesting to see later, Mormons coming at the family of their beloved Joseph Smith. Anyway, my point with this is Juanita Brooks's papers are teeming with Brigham Young's impact theology and his transformation of the American West. And it really did, for all my resentment for Brigham Young, I have to admit that he was able to accomplish a tremendous orchestration of colonizing, for better or for worse, like I said. And I do have to admit that. All right, the next one is just for funsies. Anyone researching the Mormon underground period where polygamous men and women were being sought after and sometimes apprehended by the federal government for practicing polygamy in the periods of 1870s through the 1890s would do well to peruse Juanita Brooks' papers. There are countless accounts of the Mormon underground, including Juanita's own grandfather, Dudley Levitt's family history with it. What has been really fun and interesting for me is to see the playfulness in which Mormons during this time engaged in their struggle. This generation, less so than the parents who dealt with the conflicts with Gentiles and federal government and violence, identified now as Americans, albeit still persecuted. It's a really interesting transformation, Mormons' relationship with America at the time. But by the time we get into the Mormon underground period, most of these people saw themselves as very patriotic Americans. Their resistance to outsiders often came in the form, instead of violence and, running from the law in the time of Joseph Smith, they were still running from the law, but it became more playful in the form of music and games. And so I have found several pieces of music, poetry, and songs that the community would come up with to sort of cope with the government officials' insistence that they give up the principle, including this clip of a song from the reminiscences of Joseph T. Walker. So I'll give you an example. McGeary searched MacArthur's house, goodbye, my lover, goodbye, and all he could find was the tail of a mouse, goodbye, my lover, goodbye. This is just an example of one of the songs they sang in the Mormon underground, which I think is really fascinating. Sometimes when federal agents came into a house looking to make an arrest, the agents had severely underestimated the tight network of spies and communications that Mormons employed. And someone had usually already tipped off the polygamous criminal so he could make an escape before the arrival of the government. When the agents would come up empty-handed, the children would follow after the officers and taunt them with tunes like this one. And this is a picture of some federal agents at the time. Okay, back to my seventh point, the women of the WPA. If I can return back to the WPA project for a minute, which I talked about when I talked about Paiute history and Foster Charles, I'd like to talk about the seventh point, and I'll be brief because I really go into this subject at length in my own manuscript, but I was really struck by how much women in our tradition have been some of the greatest pioneers in history. Surely they are underrepresented in professional corners, but so many of the diaries, transcripts, personal histories, genealogies, and more have been collected by Mormon women. Mormon men absolutely had a role to play in this too, and I don't mean to undermine that, but how many of the women researchers do we know about? I just want to state that following the work of Juanita Brooks, and what she did and the women she employed under WPA, it's highlighted the countless work women have done in preserving the histories of our people. Women who found employment during the Great Depression through the programs of the Civil Works Administration, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, which was 1934 through 35, and most important, under the Works Progress Administration, which is the WPA, Works Progress Administration. That was 1935 to 1943. Just those efforts alone have preserved, at least under Brooks' tutelage, over 400 pioneer journals and records that tell a more complete story of the American West. So we owe our thanks to the countless hours of typing, transcribing, and detective work that these women did. Women like Mabel Jarvis, who went on to publish a tremendous amount of valuable Southern Utah history, including the stories and histories of many of the buildings, architecture, and the cities of Southern Utah. Juanita Dune, who copied diaries up in Ogden. Katie Webb, Virginia Lee, and so many others who collected important histories that we rely on today. If somewhat begrudgingly, we acknowledge the work of Kate Carter and the Daughters of the Utah Pioneers, and yes, she did great violence to the history by destroying, burning, and omitting things she didn't like, and that's something I could rant about for hours. But even the collecting the DUP has done over the years is noteworthy and important. I'm glad to have the records we do have. I'm glad that many women under the WPA were able to do this and collect, because I encounter their work a lot. And I just wanted to mention their names because I think it's really remarkable. Okay, so back to the frontier for my eighth point. This will be brief, but I will just add that when I think of the formation of Mormonism, I really don't think enough emphasis has been placed on the impact of the isolation during the Utah period. Mormon history is still so obsessed with the Joseph Smith era, which makes sense since it offers up Mormonism in its infancy. But the Utah period is Mormonism's childhood, and it was a brutal one. I'm calling it the Utah period, but really it's a great frontier in the sense that Mormonism was global at this point. There are accounts of missions in Europe, the Pacific Islands, Jerusalem, and many other corners of the world. But even those worlds were tied to the great gathering in Utah. The isolation of the church in the desert, in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by constant threat of Indians, starvation, drought, federal government. All of this has forever scarred our psyche. I still have to remind myself just how isolated people were and how that affected their choices and their connection and their understanding to God. My modern lens with roads and planes and trains and automobiles can hardly fathom what it meant to travel west and be stuck there. The faith of the saints could be summed up in my imagining of a Mormon hymn title. I wrote this called Make Mormonism Work. At every level, it had to work, or else it meant death or great loss. As I mentioned earlier, this made the LDS Church a different religion indeed. Choices were extremely limited. Autonomy was non-existent. Dependence on cooperation with your neighbors caused great conformity, resentment, and a really weird sort of cultural inbreeding. I am constantly struck at the brutality of the Utah period. on nearly every single level. You were already battling the challenges of 19th century America, no penicillin, institutionalized racism against scores of groups of people, women's rights were severely limited, poverty, lack of education, etc. And then you throw onto this deep and pervasive stuckness in the middle of the Uinta Basin, trapped by mountains, deserts, plains, and miles of land in hostile Indian territory. Your options for survival were limited at every single turn. Add to that the memory of violence from first-generation Mormons in Missouri and elsewhere, and you have a deeply traumatized people trying to make it in an extremely impossible landscape, whose survival depended on, even though often nicely, decimating the bands of Shoshone, Ute, Paiute, and Navajo who had depended on the vastness of the wild for centuries. And I say nicely because it had a nice overture, but no remnant of kindness underneath. Every man for himself. Which brings me to my next slide. I think all of us, when considering the history of Mormonism, would do well to consider the trauma that we embedded into our spiritual, cultural, and theological and physical DNA. More needs to be considered on just how much the time in history shaped our movement. Right here, this is a photo of Maureen Whipple, author of the great American novel, The Giant Joshua, and she deserves a fair shake. Maureen was a contemporary of Juanita's and a woman who Juanita held a reserved disdain. Never one to be unkind to her face, Juanita saved her criticism for Maureen, usually in whispers or on paper. Her letters to Dale Morgan and a few others note how irritating they found Maureen. Juanita vents several times about how immature and frustrating she finds Maureen to be. So after delving into Maureen's history, and thanks to the work of her biography, Veda Tab's Tale, and the incredible series by Andrew Hall, Ad by Common Consent, I've developed a deep sympathy and respect for Maureen Whipple. She was laughed at by her contemporaries and considered manipulative, sometimes dishonest, needy, and definitely, I'm going to use this term, boy crazy, for a lack of a better term. In fact, just recently, I was speaking to a group of women and I talked about how Maureen Whipple's Wikipedia page mentioned her, quote, many infatuations with men. And it seemed to her Wikipedia page seemed to highlight the same biases women like Juanita Brooks carried against her. I was sort of aghast in reading the Wikipedia entry that mentioned at least twice that Maureen went through a lot of men. The undertone echoed those of her contemporaries. Maureen's book, The Giant Joshua, was considered a brilliant, sometimes flash in the pan by some, but it was mostly overshadowed by the idea that Maureen Whipple was a bit of a slut. She had several failed and embarrassing relationships with men, and this, of course, made her an untrustworthy and unlikable character in history. I believe it tarnished in some ways the reputation of her book and future success of her other projects. I'm not saying Maureen Whipple was an easy person. I'm just saying she didn't get a fair shake. Not until Andrew Hall's work on Maureen's upbringing, the abuse that she survived as a child, her parents' deeply toxic relationship, and her own experience with Mormon purity shame and sexism, did I realize that Maureen Whipple deserves a more holistic understanding. When I spoke about this to the women's group, a woman approached me afterwards. Her name is Sabrina Hewitt, and she is what I would call a Wikipedia pirate, a badass woman who updates the bios of women on the internet to reflect more accuracy and respect. Isn't that incredible? I love knowing there are women quietly working behind the scenes to undo some of the sexism that exists in our history. Sabrina told me she would set to righting the wrong on the Wikipedia entry. A few weeks later, she got back to me, letting me know that a librarian at BYU, who had first added the information about Maureen, had contacted her. Sabrina had taken out the many infatuations with men line, and the librarian who had entered the information wanted to know why, stating that she recognized it was sexist, but added perspective to the, quote, personality of Maureen. Sabrina responded with this quote, and this is used with permission. Quote, in my response to the original editor, I mentioned that a man's biography wouldn't mention his crushes. And if I got famous for writing a book, I hope the boys I liked wouldn't be deemed important enough to make it in my Wikipedia page. She mentioned that we could put this type of information in a personal life section. And I said that if she did, I hope she would focus it more on her marriage, divorce, and rape. End quote. I bring up Maureen because Juanita's attitudes about her reflect a similar deep wound that Juanita herself carried. One that I think a lot of Mormon people, especially Mormon women, struggle with: deep sexual shame. Peppered through Juanita Brooks's correspondence, diaries, and writings, she could hardly discuss the subject. It was so difficult for her to even articulate. During the beginnings of her marriage to Will Brooks, she lamented how much she hated sex, and her attitudes toward it didn't really shift much. I believe this bias, earnestly and fairly acquired from her upbringing and her society and culture, limited Juanita Brooks's perspective. I think it limited her work. I found a few instances in which she even omitted things she saw as too indelicate into the historical record, something Juanita Brooks was very critical of others for doing, and yet she did it herself. These stories have led me to wonder what other lies we tell ourselves as researchers, historians, and storytellers. Are our own narratives sound? Do they reflect old biases? Do they incorporate enough generational empathy? I submit that we are all limited in ways that are likely shadowed to us. But Maureen's story particularly is a good reminder that trauma is complex. The sexism that colored her narrative, just as much as it colored Juanita's, affected them both in different ways. Juanita's sexism was internalized. Maureen's was projected upon her. Our women in history deserve better, or at the very least, they deserve for us to question our own morality when we approach a subject. And my final slide, my last point is simply this: nothing I'm saying is new or unique. That has been the greatest lesson here for me. Ideas I felt like I had developed on my own have been said 100 times before me, or by folks much smarter than myself. Juanita Brooks and her friends were having the same discussions in the 1940s, 1950s that we are having today. They were coming to the same conclusions, having similar angst, similar critiques, similar viewpoints and outlooks. Humans don't change much, and I'm not sure how much progress has been made in any direction in Mormonism. There are things in Juanita Brooks's background and childhood that limited her, that harmed her personally, and prevented her from a potential she was capable of and deserved. I will discuss these limitations on paper hopefully soon enough, but I will say I was surprised how little has changed for the women in the church in so many regards. I don't mean just professionally, although I'm sure Juanita would appreciate the increase in more professional female historians that we have today. But I mostly mean culturally and doctrinally in how we look and view things. So much of the ignorance that wounded Juanita Brooks exists still. So much of the sexual shame that she held on to exists still. People were saying it was a different time back then. They didn't know how to talk about it. But I don't know how true that is. I looked through her papers and found assignments in college where she was supposed to talk about some of the sex lives of the men on the frontier that she was researching, and it was very difficult. She didn't want to do that. I know we look at our own lives as linear because that is how we experience growth as individuals. But history doesn't really grow like that. It just repeats, unless it is met with courage. Juanita Brooks changed the landscape of the past because she had the courage to be honest. Juanita is, without a doubt, one of the greatest Western historians of all time, not just for her research, but for her courage. For it is brave to tell the truth, and the best history is an honest one. And with that, I will once again say that her papers are a delight, and I have had the most unique, wonderful time getting to know her better through them. Here is a truncated biography or bibliography. I'm happy to point people to more resources. And since this is a digital recording, you'll forgive me, I have a lot to do this week. You can leave your comments and questions in the Whova app presentation, which all of our digital attendees are currently watching this from. And I'll get back to you as soon as you can. But I hope you enjoyed and appreciated what I've learned about Juanita Brooks through her papers. Thank you.